prestigious English education conference about learning from the roots, linking and matching EFL students' education with market demands, held by English Program Study of Faculty of Teacher and Training Education of Universitas Jambi. And it is occasion we shall have outstanding presentation from our prominent keynote speaker, whom I believe shall enrich our insight and knowledge regarding the theme of this conference. Before the presentation begins, allow me to introduce our prominent keynote speaker. To begin with, I would like to tell you all that Professor Marilyn was my supervisor when I studied at Groningen University a few years ago. I met her 2008, so it has been long. And this conference make me remind all the memory with her when I spent most of the time 6 years together with her in Groningen University. And Professor Marilyn is a Dutch linguist. She is a professor emeritus of English language at Groningen University and English as a second language at the University of Groningen, Netherlands. And she is known for her work on complex dynamic system theory and the application of dynamical system theory to study second language development. Her interest is also in the second language writing. Currently, she is a professor in Pannonia University, Hungary, in multilingual doctorate, a school of doctorate. And for these times, because due to the time difference, for you knows that Professor Marilyn is in Leiden right now. So Indonesia is 5 hours ahead of Netherlands. And it is about 9 o'clock in the morning in the Netherlands. And because this time differences, Prof. Marilyn has prepared the recorded presentation to all of us in order to avoid many disturbances that might occur later because of the internet connection and so on and so forth. Because for you to know that Professor Marilyn now lives in a boat house, so she travels a lot on the water, on the sea. So maybe the internet connection will be a problem. Okay, without further ado, let's watch together the presentation of Professor Marilyn. The time is yours, Professor Marilyn. The time is yours, Professor Marilyn.
Good morning, everyone. I guess I'm not sure it's morning, afternoon in your country at this moment. For me, it's morning. Good morning. Well, thank you, first of all, very much for inviting me. And I'm so honored to be at the University of Jambi. I have many good friends there. I wish I could be there in person. Uni, I remember being your supervisor and enjoying it so much. Marilyn, I just saw you not too long ago with the PhD defense of Faisal Aziz. And Mahmoud, I remember you being in Groningen and how we all got to be friends. So thank you for inviting me to the University of Jambi. And next time I hope to come in person. What I'm going to do today is talk about usage-based approach to foreign language teaching. Let me share my screen first. So there it is. Hope you can still see me. So again, thank you for inviting me. And I really like your title, Learning from the Roots. And that is really, I think, what usage-based teaching is about. and linking and matching EFL students' education with market demands. So yes, they need to learn to use the language, especially, and for whatever purposes they might need. Today, I will talk about what is a dynamic usage-based approach. I'm not going to talk too much about all the theory behind it, just the very general principles. And if you're interested, then I can show you some things to read or give you some examples. But, usage-based is not a really new method. It's linguistic principles, theoretical principles, and they can be actually put in any kind of teaching approach. So a teaching approach is not the same as usage-based linguistics. So hopefully you'll be able to realize that you can apply these principles to any method you're using. So what's the difference? I think in very general terms, look at this. If you think about Chomskyan linguistics or structure-based linguistics especially, then language is seen as something very systematic. And on the left, you see, like, in some of the principles, it's really seen as like semantics is separate from syntax, is separate from phonology, and it is rules that interact with each other. And they're little cogs, and if you change one thing, then the other things change too, but it's very, very systematic, and you can predict everything. That would be a structure-based view of language. It is according to rules. I don't know how it is in your country. In my country, in the Netherlands, our teachers really believe that language is a structured whole, and that therefore you have to teach the rules so that learners can practice those, and then they can produce language. So this is a rule-based system. Everything is predictable. Usage-based is completely opposed to the idea of rules. Basically, if you look at this other picture on the right, it's associations. I associate, for example, here I'm drinking my coffee. So a cup with drinking, the word cup, and the cup has coffee. So everything is associated with each other. So a coffee cup, and there are no rules. Basically, it's humans that have started using the language, and in use, they change it a bit. So the only way you can actually learn a language is not by learning rules, because they don't really exist, only by associations. And this goes quite far. So I will, at the end, we'll give you some, no, I guess I could do that now. So we had in Groningen, we had ILA, which is the World Conference in Applied Linguistics. And we had a fantastic plenary speaker, and I will send the link later. But Hans-Jörg Schmidt gave an excellent lecture on usage-based linguistics, and he explains very much what these associations are about. So if you're really interested in this, it's a theoretical linguistic story, but then please go listen to his lecture. What I have to say about associations is a little bit like Hans-Jörg Schmidt, but this is what Langacker says, and Langacker is the, to me, like the father of usage-based linguistics. I think he was like in the 1990s when he already talked about it, like how language was learned through use. And so he's a cognitive linguist. And this is his definition: the ability of one thought or idea to evoke another. So you have a symbolic meaning, and symbolic means there's a form and a meaning. So the word cup, and the meaning is the entity. Syntagmatic, and I think this is for us the most important in teaching English. Sequentially arranged forms and meanings. So syntagmatics is the order in which items appear. And syntagmatic means that I can learn whole little phrases like, how are you doing? What is going on? Please hand me my coffee. That words that are in a row are learned together. And the most important part here, I think, is in English, chunks and formulaic sequences. They are all sequentially arranged forms and meanings. Another one that's very important is paradigmatic. And as you, so the association could be that the word cup is a vessel, or a cup and a glass, or a cup and a bowl may kind of compete with each other. They're related in meaning, but they're not exactly the same thing. And finally, another extremely important one, pragmatic. So the association, when I hear a word like, if you are visiting me and I say, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? Then a cup of coffee is mentioned in a situation, is mentioned in a social situation. And from the situational context, even if you didn't know exactly all the words, you would understand, this person's offering me something. So a situational context is extremely important. And that is one of the things that we very often forget in teaching English. We often do the symbolic, that's fine, the syntagmatic, okay. But the pragmatic, like, when do you say these things? How do you use them? Because in every situation, we may have a slightly different meaning. So association, now let's think about a child learning the language. And for example, there's a ball, and I will say to the child, you kick the ball. And later, kick the ball, catch the ball, hold the ball, grab the ball. And so first, the child or the L2 learner may remember only this whole sequence. You kick the ball, or the ball, kick, you kick the ball. But as the learner hears and sees more of these expressions that are kind of like each other, you catch the ball, you hold the ball, you grab the hole. Then by analogy, the learner knows, it's something you do with the ball. So here you can put different kinds of actions, catch, hold, grab. And that is called, in cognitive linguistics, schematization. By analogy, you learn that there are these patterns. So rather than teaching learners subject, predicate, object, what you do is give examples, quite often the same one, but then also in different schemas. And then you have then the learner can make or can catch up with the pattern. So it's pattern recognition that humans are very good at, and that you don't need, let me see if I can, yeah. Okay, so you catch the ball, you hold the ball. So association, the child sees the ball, sees the action, realizes that we're talking to the child. And schematization, different verbs in that same, this is called slot filling. And hearing it many times, the learner can deduct their own rules. So basically, usage-based linguistics is based on the premise that language learning is input dependent. That is crucially shaped by the particular language patterns a given learner is exposed to. So frequency of exposure, the more, the better. Not talking about the language, but hearing the language is what, in a usage-based view, and using the language and understanding the language. And this is not so strange when you think about, 1972 already, how to remember items. The more attention you give to it and the more manipulation, the better it will be remembered. So seeing it And for example, with absolute beginners, if you want to teach something like kick the ball, give attention to the ball, manipulate it, kick it, catch it, hold it. And the more you repeat it, the greater the chances it will be remembered. And this is again a bit of Langacker. Language is a matter of individual processing. So there is no such thing as a language out there. It's all in our minds and in our own minds, whether it's the L1 or the L2, language resides in patterns of neurological activity. So this is what Langacker says: becoming a fluent speaker involves a prodigious amount of actual learning. So if you want to learn English or whatever, you need to spend a lot of time on it, and frequency of exposure. And in my own theory, dynamic usage-based linguistics, it's also very important that you do input before output. One of the reasons is everything may compete with each other. And if you try to repeat everything, if you try to speak too early, then you may not have had enough time to really listen carefully. So listen, and perhaps watch movies or whatever, or listen to the teacher. And the output is definitely important. You don't learn the language without output, but do give your learners a chance to listen to things. I also use this in, I am now supervising Lilik. And I forgot to say that Lilik actually invited me for this, so I'm sorry, Lilik. But we're doing something about academic writing. And again, we're using a genre approach, but read before you write. Because if you don't know what others say, you don't know what you say. So input before output is the biggest, the most important tenet of usage-based linguistics. Okay, so the points of a usage-based, dynamic usage-based approach is here. It would be best not talking about the language, talking in the language, real usage events. So in English, and we can do it with movies, we can do it with readings, we can do it with documentaries, but exposure to the language, real usage events, and lots of exposure, and input before output. So reading before writing, listening before speaking. And thumbs, I haven't talked about that, but that means form, use, meaning, mappings. Other books called constructions. But I like to say thumbs because it's the usage, it's the context, it's the pragmatic context that's so important. So that use is the pragmatic context. So form, use, meaning, mappings. And especially early on, especially when students are just learning, repetition and imitation. And I think, like from like a 0 level to like beginner level, that is very important to actually be able to remember words and constructions and manipulations, like we talked about, like kick the ball, catch the ball, using the language slightly differently, just so that people recognize that there are different patterns. So what I'd like to do now is talk about previous approaches. And previous approaches, actually, there's so many of them, and I probably forget some, but all of them could actually be used with a usage-based approach, and none of them are really wrong. So let's look at, for example, structuralism. We had the audiolingual methods, and I don't know if you remember them, if you actually ever used them, but we would sit in the language lab, have earphones on, and then we would have these little sentences like, John went to the store, Peter. Peter went to the store. Mary went to the store. Movies. Mary went to the movies. And so there was short sentences, and you had to kind of repeat them. And sometimes they would give you another word, and you would have to make another little pattern. In a way, it's beautiful. It was actually a very good method for absolute beginners, except that it was based on grammar. Like if you could listen, and John kicks the ball, John grabs the ball, John throws the ball. And if you had little pictures with that, then actually it would be very useful. But in this particular method, it was all about the grammar. If you got the third person singular, and I must admit that it was so boring, and I just ended up not using it all. One method that's similar to it, but that is meaning-based, is the learnables by Harris Winnitz. And if anybody's interested, you can look it up on the internet, the learnables. And he has pictures and these little sentences and also a lot of repetition. And I think that method just works beautifully for beginners. But so audiolingual methods are not necessarily bad, but language is not highly systematic. And that's different from what a usage-based approach would say. Practice makes perfect, yes. And so audiolingual methods had a great deal of input and repetition, which is good. But like I said, it had an emphasis on grammar and sentence patterns. And there was no meaning at all. And basically, if you remember the two pictures, this was on that with all these little cogs on the left. Syntax patterns drive the system. So I would say audiolingual methods may be very good, especially early on, but not based on grammar, but based on meaning. And a very good example is the learnables by Harris Winnitz. And I actually also did a test, or I published on it, and we had students that looked at the only used his method, Winnitz's method, and they outperformed students that only did like 4 classes per week. So it does work, the repetition and whatever, but no focus on grammar. That would be better. Communicative language teaching. I think we all, at least in the Netherlands, all our books are so-called communicative language teaching based. And they are based on meaning and based on input. So basically, they have just about everything a usage-based method would want. This is based on notional functional linguistic syllabi, so focus on functions, focus on using the language in real situations like asking, promising, stating. And it was also very much based on the learner's needs as a social user of language, and that would dictate what happens in the classroom. And communicative language teaching prioritizes understanding of the meaning of utterances over the grammatical form. Sorry. I don't know what's happening here. Yep. So CLT prioritizes understanding of the meaning of utterance over the grammatical forms. Perfect. This is what also usage-based linguistics is about. But no, also when you look at one of our, Michael Wong, also Lightbound is a textbook, but CLT reflected a move away from linguistics as the main or only basis for deciding what the units of language teaching would be. And there was an enormous focus on meaningful utterances, which is really good. But there was not really a theoretical view on what drives the linguistic system. At that time, structural linguistics was still the most accepted theory of language. And I don't know about your country, but in the Netherlands, we have books that say that they are communicative, but our teachers spend out of the class, and we've measured this, about 75% teaching grammar. And that is, of course, not a communicative method. So I think communicative methods are wonderful as long as you just don't teach grammar. And so the fact that it moved away from linguistics is not really what happened. Basically, many teachers and also the book writers and really see language as a structure-based entity, and therefore there's lots of focus on grammar. So communicative methods are wonderful, but take out the grammar. Actually, I have a colleague who has done an experiment, 2 years experiment. So we had like one of these typical Dutch textbooks for high school. And it had like the stories and the listening activities and the speaking activities and everything else that goes with it. And it had 2 pages of grammar in each chapter. And one class got the book. There was a one group, 1 year, with the grammar explanation. And the next year, they tore out all these grammar explanations from the book. And then they compared these students after 2 years. First of all, there was no difference in accuracy. And secondly, the ones, because in class, rather than talking about the grammar, they spent more time reading and they spent more time listening, and there was more interaction because all that grammar was no longer taking up all that time. And the students did better. They were more fluent. They were, especially these longer formulaic sequences, they were able to use better. And they did not make more errors. So basically, by carrying out the grammar explanations, they made it a communicative approach, and it worked much better. We've also talked about the natural approach and Krashen and Terrell in the late 1970s. And it's really a shame that Krashen is no longer taken as seriously by some of my colleagues in applied linguistics, because I think he had the right point of view. He would say that communication is more important than the form. I mean, you need to learn the language in a stress-free environment, have some fun. Comprehensible language, input before output. So a usage-based approach is totally in line with the natural approach. And what you do is you focus on meaningful utterances, and you have, but again, there was no explicit view on what drives the linguistic system. At that time, this is when Chomsky came up, and universal grammar, and especially applied linguists were very interested in how people would learn that grammar. And Krashen was, although I was not really able to explain, because this theory did not exist yet, why this would work. And now we do, because of usage. And one of the biggest discussion was, and this was Chomsky, how can you be creative if you only imitate? And that's where the dynamics comes in. We can create new, meaningful utterances. We don't just imitate. Children don't just imitate, but they do have to use the language quite often and hear it often before then they can create new types of utterances. So the natural approach makes a lot of sense. And at that time, unfortunately, usage-based linguistics was not fashionable yet. And it kind of petered out, and too many people were interested in how people learned the syntax rather than the meanings of words. Another one is the comprehension approach. I don't know if you've probably seen it in textbooks or in like teacher training textbooks. Comprehension approach, again, it's perfect. Especially, they tried this out in Canada quite a lot, and they had these children with picture books and earphones in, and they listened to the story with pictures, and all they did was listen to stories, but they were very meaningful because they were explained in simple words, and especially children's books. They start off with very short sentences. And the focus was on input and meaning. And the idea was the learner would pick out what it could at that time. And this method really worked. There's quite a lot of evidence that the learners were better at, I think it was at French at that time, it could have been English. I think it was French. The thing is in the end, they also need to learn to speak. So I think the comprehension approach is extremely good, but not all the time. So after there's enough vocabulary, of course, you need, or in little sentences, as soon as the learner has those, he needs to learn to use them also. But again, because we were so interested in the syntax and how learners get to be creative, this approach was no longer taken very seriously. And it really is a shame, because I think it works beautifully. And there's evidence, lots of evidence, that just focus on input and meaning, that learners learn the language from that. Okay, so I think in the time that I was studying English, and that is a long time, and when I was becoming an applied linguist, there was a great deal of attention to these dichotomies. So especially Chomsky came out with, this is competence, this is what you know, this is the rule system in your head, and this is what you do, performance. In usage-based linguistics, there is no abstract knowledge in your mind. It's all performance. It's just repetition of a repertoire of small chunks that you use. A lot of applied linguists have looked at, is declarative knowledge the same as procedure knowledge? Can one become the other? And I think almost, the consensus is that declarative cannot become procedural. So knowing a rule does not help you produce it. If you know that there's a third person singular S on a word, like he drinks coffee with the S, if you just practice that and talk about it, that does not make the student produce a S, third person singular S. And so basically, for a learner to produce a third person singular S, he or she does not need to know that there's a rule, but just listening, repeating, recognizing the pattern would be much better. From a usage-based, so this is Krashen, who said that learning is quite different from acquisition. And learning about, with a declarative knowledge, explicit grammar, is not the same as acquisition. And a usage-based view would agree with that. Learning about does not lead to procedural knowledge nor to acquisition. Does that mean we can never talk about anything, any grammar? That is not true either. Sometimes it helps for us to kind of recognize a little pattern, but not talking about it for an hour does not help you know the rule. The same goes for implicit and explicit. So declarative knowledge is often explicit grammar, and performance, procedure, acquisition, and implicit all kind of are on the same line. And I think in most structure-based teaching approaches, I think I hope you agree, people have focused on the form and not so much on the meaning, as if the form is the most important thing. But if you think about language, who cares if the form is a bit wrong, as long as the meaning comes across? So we should be focusing in our classes on meaning, making meaning. And in applied linguistics, there's a big distinction between social theories and cognitive theories. Well, from a usage-based perspective, the social and the cognitive, it's all associated. So the cognitive might then be, for example, having recognized a pattern, but also with the social, knowing when to use that pattern. So these dichotomies, if you think about usage-based linguistics, we are talking about performance. There is no language competence. Declarative is not necessary to learn to speak it. We don't need to learn explicitly to acquire the language. And we need to focus on the meaning, and we need to combine the social and the cognitive. So the DUB, dynamic, means that all these subsystems are interconnected and continually interact and change over time. So from a usage-based perspective, these dichotomies are really not needed. Another very common language teaching approach is task-based language learning. And if you think about it, it's basically a communicative language teaching approach, but very much with the output and interaction hypothesis. So rather than, and it was very much also informed by bilingual education in Canada, that only listening does not help you become a proficient speaker. Only input does not help you learn the language. You must produce output. And also interaction is needed, because in interaction you can see, hey, what I say is not understood by the other. And this is kind of interesting also when you think about the interaction hypothesis. Now, Faisal Aziz, who is in Indonesia, has just finished his PhD with me, and he had this excellent dissertation on how learners in Muslim boarding schools interact in English quite a bit. And they do for 2 years, and they do learn English. But if you only interact, then and don't have the input, then you don't learn enough new language, and you only repeat what the other has said. So even though I totally agree that you do need output and you do need interaction, the thing is, that is not what language learning is about. That is to practice it. So in task-based language learning, I think nowadays, I hope many of you are teacher trainers, you agree with me that the emphasis is on the output and interaction. And although I think that's very useful, if you take a usage-based point of view, then you first need the input. So yes, interact, but based on some preferably authentic input. So perhaps show a documentary or show read a book or read a text or do something, and then, but at least the input that the students have the language to use in interaction. And the meaningful tasks will help learners practice. And I don't know if you guys have, what kind of books you have, but often the tasks given are very, it says something, okay, look at this train schedule and find out how to get from A to B. And then the learners do this together. But it's a very meaningful task, but they've never heard how to do these things. So they will invent their own language. And then these learners teach each other the language they invent themselves. And it's not the authentic language that they should be practicing. And there's definitely a focus on meaning and form. So again, task-based language learning, when you look at it, it doesn't have a usage-based linguistic theory, more the structure-based. People are still interested in whether the person learns the third person singular or not. And many tasks are based on grammar rules. And it's okay to practice these, but why focus on the grammar? You could also focus on the meaning and all the words. And output is the key to language learning. So I think task-based language learning is a wonderful way of teaching language in the classroom. But my suggestion, if you're a usage-based linguist, then bring in the input before you practice the output. So reading and watching movies or whatever, and use language to interact about, but don't give them a task without having given them the language to begin with. So let's review a little bit. So previous and current approaches. In almost, and this is, I'm not just saying it, I'm basing this on what is happening in the Netherlands. And I must say, we've done a study, we've observed classrooms, and it is amazing how, despite the fact that these are called communicative approaches or task-based approaches, it's the teachers that just want to teach the grammar. I guess it gives them control. It's something that you can test, but what a waste of time. And I think, as I mentioned in the TBL, task-based language learning, if you read back, and I think there's like a wonderful book out now by Michael Long, who previously, was passed away not too long ago, but one of his most recent books is on task-based language learning, and he really, really also emphasizes the input, but it's just the textbooks and and he emphasizes the meaning, but it's what teachers do in the classroom, and that really kind of makes the whole theory not work. So what is the DUB approach? Acquisition is mastery of forms at all levels. And when I say mastery of forms at all levels, I'm not talking about grammar. I'm talking about words. I'm talking about chunks. I'm talking about how to write a text in English with the introduction and the conclusion. It's mastery of forms at meaning level, at organization level. But the forms are unique, and many have to be learned separately. So there are thousands of words in the language, and there may be about, say, 20 rules. And what do our teachers in the Netherlands do? They focus on those 15 rules rather than on the thousands of words and chunks that have to be learned. And input is needed to first process, form meaning pairs. I'm sure you've heard about content language integrated learning or bilingual education or immersion learning. And when you think about it, it is actually a highly communicative method. The teacher speaks in the L2 to the learner about math, about biology. And I don't know if I've never been to look at your schools, but I've attended quite a few in the Netherlands. I used to assess the programs, and it was just so interesting to see. So it was like a Dutch teacher whose English was not perfect, didn't matter, but the teacher would explain math or biology. The nice thing about math and biology is it has pictures and it has little things to do. And especially math is kind of simple to learn in a foreign language because you can look at the numbers and you can figure it out. And so actually these were basically meaningful input methods. And it is amazing to see how fast these children with this type of method learn the language. You know, even, of course, Dutch and English are very similar. It's easier for Dutch kids to learn English. But within about 6 months, they were able to understand all the English. You know, of course, they got 15 hours of that per week. So it's not just 2 hours, but 15 hours. But what was so nice is the teacher focuses on the message as a whole. So I think content language integrated learning, so it's the content and the language. And so you learn the content and the language at the same time. So the focus is not on English, the focus is on math, on biology, on whatever. And the teacher uses simple language at first and shows it on the board, sometimes even translates little things and uses translanguaging, but the teacher teaches a subject. And that is probably the most meaningful communicative method that you could have. And in good CLIL, content language integrated learning, the teacher is aware that the learner may not know all the words. And so when they talk about a text, say in history or whatever, then the teacher explains the meaning of the words so the learner understands the context. And the teacher uses the L2 throughout. And I don't, you know, there's like a wonderful book, Content Language Integrated Learning, that has all these activities that helps entrench the content. So the learners, because they need to learn the words, they do activities to kind of repeat the words and use them. And then they actually, the students have to use the content and talk to each other to talk about the content. So basically, this is task-based language learning with lots of input and output, meaningful tasks. But what it is, it doesn't focus on English. It focuses on math or biology or content. And I think that that is what English teachers should do, is forget about the English, teach content, whatever it is that the kids are interested in. And so if it's about tourism in a hotel, if you're teaching English, let them see, teach the whole content in English, and then let them practice about the content in class. So general principles, they can be applied to many of the approaches. You don't have to change approaches. You just have to tear out the grammar rules. And the general principles are form, meaning, mapping. So this is what it means, and this is what it looks. Use scaffolding, pictures, visuals, repeating, whatever, so that the learners understand the meaning. And if need be, use the L1. A bit of translanguaging is fine, as long as the input is, there's some really authentic input. Perhaps, and so rather than the scaffolding can sometimes be used in the L1, the quick translation can be given or whatever. But we know from research that to learn a word, to learn an expression, you have to, just to hear it, you have to hear it about 8 times before you can even recognize it. So repetition, and you have to focus on both the form and the meaning. And I think it's especially important to look at whole phrases. And quosts is my way of saying conventionalized ways of saying things. So there are so many little conventionalized phrases in English and in every language. And the whole phrases that are conventionalized, that is what we need to focus on. And I think pronunciation is important, spelling is important. So all of that is important. And perhaps also the grammar is a bit important, but it's not the focus. And if you look at the CLIL general principles, that's exactly what they do. And they focus both on form and meaning. But in CLIL, in content language integrated learning, they focus on the concepts. And when you do math or biology, then you have these conventionalized ways of saying things within the field. So that is the end of my talk. I'm going to try and join you if I have internet connection. So if I'm not there, then please, I'm sorry. I do hope that if you have questions or whatever, do email me and I would be more than happy to answer you. Or if perhaps Lilik, you can collect all the questions for me and put them in one email, and then I can respond to you guys. So thank you for listening. Thank you for all, stop share. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this is a bit of what you wanted. It's a shame I can't be there. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Marilyn, for the comprehensive and informative and also interesting talk about dynamic usage-based approach. That I make note here that when we use dynamic usage-based approach, we don't talking about language, but we're talking in language. By the way, for your information, Professor Marilyn, besides speaking English, she is able to speak Dutch, Germany, and also French. And for your information as well, she pursued PhD at General Linguistics Faculty of Arts, Leiden University, Netherlands. And then for her master, she pursued at Linguistics, Louisiana State University, USA. And for her bachelor degree, she went to Engels School for Taal and Letterkunde. It is about English, School of English. your questions or okay, sorry. Now we are at the question and answer sessions. Due to Professor Marilyn can join us here, so we give you chance to deliver your question or comment by writing them, and then you can send it to committee. The committee will send your suggestion, comment, or questions related to this topic, and then directly sends to her. Yeah. And I think because this is, I think we come to the end of this presentations, and I hope that Prof. Marilyn will come here some days, and we are looking forward to meeting her here, and then the presentation will be beneficial for everybody here. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for Professor Marilyn Fersburg and Dr. Sri Wahyuni. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move into parallel session, I would like to inform you there will be a survey that all of you have to fill. This survey is about today's event, and you have to fill it right after this plenary session ends. For all the participants, we are going to have break around 10 minutes, and after that, you can click link on your comment section down below or link in your email to continue to parallel session. See you in 10 minutes. Dear all participants, please check your email and you can continue to join through that link in your email. Thank you.